Can you hear me? Yeah. Before we start, I want to apologize for my croaky voice, but I've just come back from London, and apart from the cold, there were too many visits to the local Chinese restaurant. So, good afternoon, and thank you for all being here. I'm about to take you, like Julian said, on a short journey relating my experiences in the football industry. Before I start, I want to wish the Gibraltar Cultural Services and Julian for the kind invitation. My love affair with football started at a very early age, playing the beautiful game with friends in the back streets of Baalbek. But this particular journey started in 2003, shortly after I lost my job in banking. It was very sudden and very unexpected, and I found myself unemployed with a young family and fighting a legal battle against the Royal Bank of Scotland group, which I subsequently won 18 months later. But from a professional perspective, I was a really empty soul. I sought advice from two individuals that I've always held in high regard. Current Chief Minister and fellow Liverpool supporter, Fabian Picardo, and James Levy, even though he's a very passionate and annoying Manchester United fan. Their support was crucial to start my own sports management agency. I decided before starting to study for a master's in sports law at Anglia Polytechnic University, because I was well aware of the nature of the industry, which Sir Alan Sugar once described as the most ruthless he'd ever come across.
Muy buenas a todos. Seguro que estáis disfrutando de Kenneth como lo llevo yo haciendo años. Disfrutando de una persona del mundo del fútbol un tanto atípica, con valores que a veces escapa en este deporte que nos vuelve loco a todos y que él antepone a cualquier tipo de negocio. Kenneth es como yo llamo, un emprendedor del fútbol, porque sin mucho bagaje a su espalda se lanzó al ruedo y bueno, pues fue capaz de abrir fronteras y de encontrar un hueco en este complicado mundo del fútbol, de la representación, de la intermediación, de lo que es el negocio de este deporte que queremos. Me quedo con el Kenneth, evidentemente amigo, pero sobre todo con esa persona que, como digo, tiene unos valores que en el mundo del fútbol no son muy normales o muy habituales. Un saludo y disfruta.
During the summer of 2003, I met Ramón Rodríguez Verdejo, known in footballing circles as Monchi, Seville's sporting director. Today, he is considered the best in the world in that specific role. The first time proved to be a real eye-opener at the challenge that lay ahead of me, and he left me with a very important message, which to date is sacred to me, as I discharge my professional duties. Me dice, la clave del éxito es encontrar el gris, Kenneth. Estamos muy acostumbrados al blanco y al negro. Shortly after meeting him, the first client that I had managed to sign up was subjected to a battle for his signature between both Seville clubs, Betis and Sevilla. And I was suddenly immersed in negotiations with the two most ruthless individuals in Spanish football at the time, Lopera from Betis and the Nido of Sevilla. Literalmente me habían tirado a la boca del lobo. It was an extremely tense 6 months, during which time I witnessed and experienced things which made me think whether I really wanted to develop this as a career. There were nasty messages from rival fans, countless menacing calls, and to a point that I noticed that I was being followed by suspicious-looking individuals. I had a huge responsibility on my inexperienced shoulders, but in the end, and despite the mountain of obstacles to overcome, we got there. And on the 23rd of June 2004, Sevilla announced the player as a signing.
Buenas tardes a todos, amigos míos y querido Kenneth. Bueno, hablar de Kenneth Asquez, yo voy a intentar ser imparcial, aunque tengo un problema, ¿no? Que quiero mucho a Kenneth y que evidentemente para mí todo lo que diga va a pasar por el filtro de que soy amigo suyo, pero lo cierto es que hablar de Kenneth Asquez a nivel de agente de futbolistas, de representante intermediario, es hablar de lo máximo a nivel europeo. Para mí un agente que es una referencia, que domina el mercado inglés, que domina el mercado portugués, que domina el mercado turco, que domina el mercado español y que a mí me parece que a ese nivel, bueno, el capo Jorge Méndez y él pueden ser de los representantes que más influencia tienen en distintos mercados a nivel internacional. Kenneth tiene además Kenneth tiene una característica principal que lo hace mejor que todos estos que hemos nombrado como Jorge Méndez, que es un cachondo, es un tipo cercano, es una maravilla de persona. Yo recuerdo como la primera vez que yo de periodista lo llamé. Yo soy de Sevilla y la verdad es que tengo un inglés algabeño que poco nada se me entiende, y como cuando lo llamé por su nombre, Kenneth Asquez, yo creía que hablaba un cerrado inglés. Intenté mantener una conversación con él, él me dio bola y hacía como que me entendía, que no me entendía, hasta que empezó a hablarme en llanito y ya pudimos mantener una conversación. Se rió de mí, en mi cara, y a partir de ahí pues forjamos una gran amistad, ¿no? Yo creo que la importancia que tiene Kenneth en este mercado y en este mundo, aparte de lo buena persona que es, de lo cachondo que es y de cómo nos trata a todos, es que no miente. Cuando te puede decir algo te lo dice, y cuando no. Y segundo, que no depende de su agenda de futbolista. Él se ha hecho necesario para clubes y para jugadores, como intermediario, como una persona que acerca postura, como una garantía para que una operación salga bien. Si Kenneth está de por medio en esas operaciones, aunque el futbolista no sea suyo y el club no lo maneje él con asiduidad, pero digamos que le da seriedad a ese tipo de operaciones, y la verdad es que para mí es un referente y es un ejemplo. Te quiero mucho, Kenneth, y un abrazo para todos los demás. Aprendan un poquito de Kenneth, que es el que maneja aquí la leña.
We had to edit the video. Thank you. We had to edit it because the first time he recorded it, he included all the swear words that he threw out after 10 minutes that I owned up, that I was able to communicate with him in Spanish. Slowly after this move, I had become a slave, for want of a better word, for the player and his family in Sevilla. I was getting calls at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning from his wife, complaining that the garage door wouldn't open. And I was also, and when you tell them to change the battery in the remote control, they took it offensive. Anyway, I was also getting calls from a mountain of creditors to whom the player owed money, and I was their only point of contact, so they were chasing me and harassing me on a daily basis. So I thought to myself that this was not really the reason that I'd stepped into the industry. But unfortunately, I was held captive as my livelihood depended on the income streams from here. I had it clear in my mind that I had certain skills which could be put to much better use. The aim was always to create a bridge from Spain and Portugal into the Premier League. As a Gibraltarian, I was perfectly placed to provide a key set of skills to English, Spanish and Portuguese football teams, as I was bilingual and understood the different cultures to perfection. I also understood from the technical perspective the differences between the game in England, Portugal and Spain.
Hola, soy Antonio Valencia y habla de Kenneth habla de persona honesta, de persona respetuosa, y bueno, en este mundo del fútbol es complicado encontrar gente honesta y sincera, ¿no? Y Kenneth tiene todo ese requisito, y nada, mandarle muchos saludos a todos y bueno, muchas bendiciones, cuídense, chao.
In the interim, I received further proof that being a player's agent was not really the future I was looking for. After successfully transferring a player within La Liga, and despite the fact that there was a contract in place for the introducer to receive his share of the fees, he suddenly demanded immediate payments of the full amount he was due. For those of you who may not be aware, fees are normally paid during the duration of a player's contract. I was in no position to financially to absorb these immediate commitments, and started to receive nasty messages by text and voice clips. I tried to block them, however difficult it was, and tried to pursue my day-to-day activities as normal. But then I woke one morning with a message which sent me plummeting into total darkness. The message read: varón, 11 años, hembra, 9 años, Colegio San José. Por cierto, arregla el portón del bloque a donde vives. I was well aware of the cutthroat nature of the industry, as it was notorious, but nothing could have ever prepared me for this. I didn't know how to manage the situation and kept the matter to myself, which was probably wrong. But it was how I decided to deal with the matter. And even though, without realizing it, I was entering into a state of severe anxiety. I thought the problem would go away. It didn't. It got worse, and so did the messages. Eventually, after 3 months, and with the help of some close friends, we dealt with the matter in the best way possible. And that dark chapter was closed. Whether the threats were genuine or not, I would never know. But with a young family, I was not prepared to take any unnecessary risks. I never thought or sought, as I should have, professional help for the anxiety, as in my mind I was doing well, even though, in fact, I wasn't.
Hola, para mí, Kenneth Asquez es honestidad, trabajo, es encanto, porque para conocer tanta gente y para mantenerlos atentos es claramente una necesidad. Y es lo que en inglés se dice delivery. Si necesitas algo, te lo producen. La verdad que eso son condiciones necesarias, pero no siempre presentes en la misma persona en este mundillo. Así que la verdad que estoy muy contento de ser amigo de Kenneth. Agradecerle muchas de las cosas que ha hecho por mí, en especial, no sé si tendrá muchas ganas de que se diga esto, pero hizo una generosa contribución al Gibraltar United, del que soy presidente, en la 9ª división inglesa, porque esa semana andábamos muy justos y se nos fastidió la máquina de cortar el césped. Había que arreglarla y adivinad quién pagó el arreglo. Y no fue barato, para nada. Así que gracias, Kenneth, y encantado de ser amigo.
Shaimo, no te creas que el donation fue tan grande, que todos los años sale tú bastante bien parado. Within a short period of time, one of the few persons who was able to bring the best out of me was suddenly gone at the age of 59, my auntie. Without realizing, I was a mess. I was angry with everything and everyone, and life didn't seem worthwhile living, and not fair. Nothing was going right, and was still no sight of turning the corner. I had become by now extremely vulnerable and subconsciously wearing a number of masks to hide my anxiety. And now comes the hard part. I don't want your pity. I'm just seeking your understanding. I was still really good at spotting players with potential for a bigger market in England, and really good at solving other people's problems. But what I'm not really good at is me. I'm not very good at talking about me. I'll talk about what I've done, and I'll talk about where I've been. But I won't tell you much about me. My marriage collapsed. I make no excuse for what I'm about to say. But from my experience, it is an absolute and utter disgrace how family law is allowed to operate locally where child abuse and parental alienation is ingrained in the system. This has to stop. So I really welcome the Minister for Justice and Equality having taken the lead in this respect. I was in serious trouble by this time, as he continued court hearings with FIFA regarding unpaid professional fees, and my own personal family court issues continued. This had, unbeknown to me, triggered off some serious depression issues that had ruined my work productivity, as I could barely do any work. I just felt out of control. Nothing made sense. It was very hard to get up in the morning, and I wanted to be on my own more. For the first time, it was put to me that I should meet up with a mental health professional, but I shook my head in disapproval, as I felt a profound sense of shame and a huge weight of disgrace. One evening, it dawned on me that the only way possible out of all of these problems was to end it all, as I could not entertain the idea of speaking to anyone about the constant pain that I was feeling. I was just feeling empty, and my existence was pointless, and that I was a burden. I was on my own. It's not the best place to be when you're down, but it seemed to be the only solution. I was very, very lucky, as that night I was found by someone that I would never forget, even though, unfortunately, he is no longer with us. And the following day, He took me to visit a mental health specialist and was diagnosed with clinical depression. There is no shame in taking care of one's mental health. Society historically is very uncomfortable with emotions, but I have learned that by being honest about how I feel, it doesn't make me weak, it makes me human. More importantly, maybe, by speaking out, I can help others out there too.
Buenas a todos. Empezaré diciendo que de fútbol sé muy poco, muy poco, pero mi especialidad es la psicología. Es en este ámbito donde he conocido a Kenneth hace ya muchos años, de la primera vez que lo vi aquí en consulta, y me encontré a una persona que estaba pasando, creo que por su peor momento. Tengo el criterio, creo que las personas que cuando están pasando por el peor momento es cuando demuestran verdaderamente quién son. Y puedo aseguraros que en ese momento descubrí a una persona maravillosa, tanto por su capacidad de amar, de querer a las personas y sus criterios éticos. También me sorprendió mucho y me sigue sorprendiendo su fuerza, esa fuerza que tiene para tirar para adelante a pesar de todo, esa capacidad de lucha que vosotros conoceréis dentro del fútbol, seguro, y admiraréis de él, su inteligencia, su capacidad de sobreponerse a todo lo que venga, y eso es su calidad humana. Ambas cosas son las que yo destacaría de Kenneth. Tengo esa suerte de conocerlo y vosotros que estáis ahí supongo que también, así que disfruta hoy de él y de este día que seguro que va a ser estupendo. Un saludo, Kenneth.
Overcoming this obstacle proved to be a massive turning point, as shortly after I received a call from the then West Ham manager, Sam Allardyce. They had to replace the current goalkeeper, but they didn't have a big budget, so I had to make a short list of a couple of keepers who were relatively unknown in La Liga at the time, therefore making them cheap. At the end of that season, Sam flew over to Spain and met one of the candidates I had proposed, and he was very impressed. So he asked us to fly to London the following weekend, when a final decision would be made. The day finally arrived, and as we made our way to the designated hotel in East London and sat patiently for a decision, it wasn't very patient, it was nerve-wracking. It was brought to our attention that in a separate hotel, Joel Robles, who had played that last season at Wigan Athletic on loan in the Premier League, was also sitting patiently. It was a straight decision between them both. In the end, Sam went with my candidates, Adrian, which brings the following clip into context.
And now it's Joel Robles. Can he hold his nerve against Adrian? Oh! Bumps off the underside of the crossbar and out. And now he has to produce heroics. Immediately steps into his goal. With West Ham one penalty away from going through. And it's role reversal time. How do you like your drama? Adrian. One Spanish goalkeeper against another Spanish goalkeeper. Looks like he's going for power. Olé! And West Ham are through to a fourth round tie at Bristol City.
Adrian quickly established himself that season as West Ham's first choice keeper and a very firm fan favourite. So as a result, confidence in me grew from within the higher echelons of the club. The following summer, the club appointed Slaven Bilic as manager, and the owner, David Sullivan, insisted on meeting him after his appointment. The first time, we were both naturally very apprehensive of each other. But with the transfer window closing that summer, I visited the training ground as they were still looking for a couple of positions. As I sat in Slaven's office, going through possible reinforcements with him, He suddenly threw a mark at me and pointed to a tactical board located at the wall of his office. He told me with a huge grin on his face, "Come on, let's see what you're made of, and how well you know West Ham and your own team Liverpool. If you were in my shoes, how would you go about winning at Anfield on Saturday?" There was absolutely no pressure on my shoulders. When I finished, he started laughing and said, "Well done. That's 90% of what me and my staff had in mind for Saturday." 2 days later...
Hello. I met Kenneth 2015 when I was at West Ham United, and since then he's been a great help for me. In my job, he's one of the few people that I trust the most. We are in contact. He became a friend. We are talking almost every day. And as I said, he's been a great help. Why? Because you can trust him. He's trustworthy. His connections are top. His knowledge about the game, inside out, he knows the game. And to be fair, his work ethic is unbelievable. And you can rely on him. And very important thing, one of the most important things in our job is to get the informations on time, and he delivers them. So many times I ask him, and I keep asking him his opinion and to check me the information on some player, his character, his contract situation, would he like to come, and all that, and that's quite of a job. And he comes back to me in no time. So he delivers, and that's the key. That's crucial. And he gives you also his opinion straight, without any agenda behind it. And he gives you his verdict, what he thinks about that player for you, does he fit and all that, and is it possible to get him. So, great man, very complete in his job. He can give you, apart from football things, apart from on the pitch things, he can give you very good information and advices on financial situations, on taxes. So his network is quite impressive. More than anything, he's a good man. He's a great fan, and in a very short time he became my proper friend, and I count him as a friend now. So for me, it's a big pleasure and a big privilege to know him and to work with him. So thanks a lot, amigo.
I'm conscious that I've exceeded my time, and before Seamus blows the horn, I'm going to wrap up. In really dark times, we will all have them. If you want to know what's going to come to your rescue at the moment of most turbulence, it's going to be the people who want you to fail. It's going to be the people who told you you were never going to make it. It's going to be you reacting to your own negative voice that's going to tell you you can't make it. And it's going to be you who's going to say, to hell with that. I will, and I am, and I can do whatever I set my mind to if I'm willing to work for it and make the necessary sacrifice. Today, as I have the privilege of standing up here in front of all of you, I want to encourage you to never give up. Anyone who feels discouraged because of pain and failures, don't surrender. Don't give up. Trust on your own strength to push forward in life. I am sure that anyone can turn the setbacks into new beginnings. Only you have the power to change. I was once told that I couldn't, and I was also told that I shouldn't, and I was also told that I wouldn't. That's why I did. Thank you for listening.
Oh, well, thank you, Julian, and thank all of you for being here and giving up a little bit of your afternoon to come and listen to me talking about poetry, a sort of ageing, portly old grandmother talking about poetry, what can be best for the post-lunchtime slot. Okay, well, I'm going to be talking about the pleasures and the perils of poetry, and I'm sure some of you are thinking, what on earth can be perilous about poetry? I mean, what can it do to you that can possibly be so dangerous? What's the worst that can happen? Maybe a few ink stains, maybe some eye strain, maybe a crick in the neck from bending over your books, maybe even a paper cut. What can poetry possibly do that's worse than that? Well, while you're pondering on that, I'm going to be speaking actually for a few moments about what I think are the quiet pleasures of poetry. Let's just see if this, no, possibly. Yeah, there we go. Okay, well, look, first of all, I love poetry. I'd like to say I'm passionate about poetry because passionate is one of those words that these days are used, sort of interchangeably with words such as like. But you know what? Poetry doesn't make my heart race. It doesn't make my heart, my breath catch in my chest or anything. Tell you the truth. These days, there's not a great deal that does. And looking at this lot, there's not going to be a great deal of passion for them either, even though I suppose that in their day they would make a little heart flutter underneath a bit of muslin at the time. But you know what? Reading poetry makes me feel relaxed, makes me feel thoughtful. It makes me feel engaged with tiny snippets and bits of time and space that perhaps I would never otherwise have known if it hadn't been for reading a particular poem. It gives me an odd sense of discovery from the safety, actually. We're talking about Perils, but from the safety of an armchair or a park bench or somewhere, this sense of discovery. When I write poetry, I feel a sense of creativity, achievement, the satisfaction of having found what I believe are exactly the right words to express a precise momentary thought. It can feel almost exhilarating without having to break into a sweat. Is this going to happen? Yes. Okay. So, look, poetry I know is not universally popular, but interestingly, book sales of poetry books have gone up a great deal in the recent years. This is Rupi Kaur, or rather one of her poems from her book. Now, she is known as an Instagram poet. I think she's in her mid to late 20s. She's incredibly successful as a poet, and that's really quite unusual. And it's largely because of the internet and the way that she has been able to get her work out there. For many people, poetry is just no more than a collection of words that don't always readily release their meaning. But as an art form, it is definitely gaining in popularity, which, makes me a very happy person. And I hope it will inspire you to touch into it and get into it a little bit. Poets can be found these days on the telly, not just reciting their work, but also sharing their thoughts on current issues. And that's, of course, because poets are thinkers, they're deep thinkers. And in this very complex day and age, we really do need powerful thinkers and good communicators. I love the fact that young people are starting to go out to bars and hold poetry slams, hold poetry evenings, open mic sessions. Poetry, as far as I can see, is coming back to its strength. And like I say, with Rupi Kaur, it's aided by the internet because poets can now give their work international exposure, which they couldn't in the past. Now, poetry in its heyday was the best means of communication. I mean, forget WhatsApp and Snapchat and all this stuff. In the good old days, before writing had really happened, except for, a few monks sitting in scriptoria somewhere, we used to pass on our stories as communities and our tribes, and we used to remember our histories about what went on in the past and our identities by means of poems. Why? Well, because it's through creating rhythms and through creating rhymes in our speech that we actually remember things. We can remember information much more effectively, and therefore we can recount information more effectively. So poetry taps into the parts of your brain that helps us to remember things. Maybe not in its full complex details, but it helps us to carry the message and remember the essence of something. And poetry is intensely powerful. Words are powerful. Words can make or break a deal, they can start a war, they can start a love affair, they can end a friendship. Words can hurt and words can heal. Poetry reaches into us intimately, it gives us insight, it exposes ideas, it illuminates parts of the world and of humanity that we'd never thought of before. In ancient times, the power of words was recognised and highly respected. Bards and poets travelled the world recording what they saw. They recorded the wars won by heroes, the tragedy of defeats, the horrors of famine and pestilence, and they recorded it all in the words of poems. Think of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the great sagas of Norse mythology. In fact, words were considered so powerful that the ancient Celts would bring their bards with them to battle. So that they could use their words to curse the enemy, which was pretty effective because the Roman army, on occasion, fled in front of the sight of the Druids and the bards, and also to compose their poems about the glorious victories and the obvious occasional tragic defeats. Wandering minstrels would be famous in courts throughout the world, and a place was always found at somebody's hearth for a poet. Think of the troubadours of medieval southern France or the Viking skulls. And even powerful leaders today will fear the curse of the bard. Maybe they'll curse the bards as well. Like many of us, I suppose, my first encounter with poetry and the way that I could play with words in my mouth was when I was a kid. And this is part of the pleasure of poetry, playing about with words. It can be a game, it can be, believe it or not, it can be fun. Through nursery rhymes, children learn to speak. They learn to understand the rhythm of language. And from there, they learn to read. And then they learn to write. Rhyming is an intensely powerful way of learning to be literate. And if my generation, I mean, we loved talking, singing rhymes about climbing hills with Jack and Jill and old Mother Hubbard, rummaging about in empty cupboards, old women that lived in shoes. My grandkids absolutely adore the rhyming stories of Julia Donaldson. I don't know if any of you have encountered them. Room on the Broom being perhaps one of the current favourites. The Snail and the Whale. I mean, it's great. Playing with words is a great way for kids to learn. Poetry is meant to be spoken aloud. It's poetry that teaches us to speak, to write, and because just a few perfectly chosen words make up a poem is the perfect thing to describe a place, a person, or a feeling. It intensifies experience. So poetry challenges us, I think, and it makes us think. That's one of the great positives of poetry. It helps us to engage the part of our brain that does the what-if bit, the bit that imagines, that explores possibilities, that creates, innovates, and invents, which is why actually poetry is a great contributor to our communities. Now, many years ago, when I was at St Mary's Junior School in the Upper Town, I had a brilliant teacher who I've never seen since, and she was called Miss Gandeas, and she introduced me to Edward Lear. And my goodness, were they wonderful words. She read us all the nonsense poems, and she helped us to explore the meaning of words which actually didn't really exist. So it really sort of helped us think about what if. What if? It's a wonderful thing for everybody, for writers. What if? The Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. I mean, what's that all about? Okay? I mean, it's nonsense, but it's fabulous. And then as she read, the poetry came to life, and then after that we looked at the pobble that had no toes, up there in the top corner, the owl and the pussycat. I went to see all the wonderful limericks that Lear wrote, and you know what? By then I was hooked. I couldn't help it. It was brilliant. Now, poetry intensifies experiences, intensifies meaning. As I grew older, when I was at home, away from school, my mum used to recite the most wonderful adventure poems. And at 78, you know what? She can still do it, and it's amazing. So I was introduced to stories about highwaymen, about the Inchcape Rock, about young Lochin Var, about Sir Lancelot in The Lady of Shalott, and then eventually worked through lots of different poems, through to W.B. Yeats, who's one of my favourite poets, and this guy here, Seamus Heaney, whose words are just absolutely wonderful. These are words that created images in my mind and triggered feelings that no visual image has matched or can match, I don't think, even though I love binge-watching Netflix just like everybody else does. So one of the foremost pleasures, as far as I'm concerned, of poetry must be its ability to encapsulate some of the most important human events, some of the most important human experiences, intensify it with selected words. And it's through the engaging of our emotions with these words that we're able to remember the poems and the messages that they try to communicate. Now, poetry can be healing. It's therapeutic. It's cleansing, both for the writer and the reader. The act, when you write a poem, of exploring your own feelings, your fears, bringing them to the fore, putting them down on paper, on a note on your phone or on a computer, it helps you face yourself and develop an understanding that perhaps you didn't have. You can release pain through poetry. The words provide like an outlet. They take the stopper off a bottle and let out the pressure. And when, as a writer, you explain something to a potential reader, you're also explaining it to yourself, so it helps you to understand things better. And as a reader, the experience of reading poetry opens up a window to your own feelings, makes you think, helps you to understand other views, other people. It helps develop self-awareness and empathy, and those are two vital ingredients of being human. Now, I could go on and on and on about the pleasures of poetry, but I've really got to get through the hazards. I can see the clock counting down. So, poetry can cause you pain. Now, we've talked about the power of words. They can inflict emotional pain. They set off a chain of harm. Now, Catullus's invectives were during the Roman times were just as vicious as the trolls are in Twitter times. I'm not going to quote any because I'd be thrown off stage by Julian for being obscene. But they were really nasty things. Ancient kings would quake at the thought of having themselves written or being the subject of a poetic nasty. So be warned, don't wind up your local poet. Okay, poetry can also wreck your posture. Okay, we can laugh at that, but actually, do you know what? You can get backache. And it's certainly, sitting around reading and writing is not going to do much for your waistline. So if you're a poet, you need to get moving and get, even if it's only as far as the library now and again, okay? Just get out there. Poetry can be difficult. Sometimes it can feel like a wall that you can't get through, that you can't climb up. And that's how I used to feel about some of the old poets, like Gerard Manley Hopkins. And if Giordano is here, I know you love him, but I still can't get on with Gerard Manley Hopkins, okay? Nevertheless, once you get through that, once you can scale that wall, some poems are absolutely exhilarating. And when you leave here, please look up The Cloth of Heaven by W.B. Yeats, and you will see exactly what I mean. Poetry can change the world. That's a scene from the Peterloo riots in Manchester in 1822, and it inspired a very famous poem by Shelley called The Mask of Anarchy. Poetry can and has fueled revolutions. It can be highly political. Nowadays, you've got George the Poet performing protest poetry to hundreds of thousands of people on YouTube. Ideas can communicate worldwide through poetry. And it can cause turbulence because people don't like things to change. They don't like things to be different. Poets are often amongst the foremost intellectuals that are censored by governments. So, it can land you in jail. All right? Freedom of speech has not always been as valued as it is now, and in some places it isn't. It still isn't. In the 1960s in the USA, the poet Allen Ginsberg was imprisoned because of his anti-nuclear and anti-war sentiments and activism, which were encapsulated in a lot of his poetry. In the UK in the 30s and 40s, an Irish poet, Brendan Behan, considered one of the foremost writers in Ireland at the time, was imprisoned because of his links to the IRA. And in 1692, Daniel Defoe was arrested for being in debt and put into prison, which happened quite frequently to poets, being in prison and being in debt, which leads me to the fact that actually, you know what, poetry can make you poor. Because if you've got to rely on your poetry for an income, then you've got to be prepared for a bit of poverty. It just doesn't pay. It doesn't pay the rent, doesn't pay for a loaf of bread. So most poets are likely to get a few quid just for a poem. Many will self-publish their work and they will never break even. Of course, it shouldn't be a prerequisite of writing good poetry to be poor, but it is rare that anybody can make a decent living just out of being a poet these days. And of course, poetry can kill. One of the worst hazards. It is pretty extreme, but look, it hasn't, and it does happen. In the days of the Spanish Civil War, just up the road in Granada, Federico García Lorca, arguably one of Spain's best poets, was shot. This young man here on the corner, Hasham Shabani, he was executed in Iran in 2014 because of his poetry and because of other reasons, but obviously he was expressing it in his poetry. In the Soviet Union in 1952, 5 Jewish poets were executed. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Yet it is because of their courage, their refusal to stay silent, their insistence of writing words, the meaning of which uttered some universal truths that threatened the powers around them. They got killed, but we inherited those words and we learnt an awful lot. Poetry has the power to move and to inspire in a way that other word forms simply don't. So, the bips are going. I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to leave you with the thought that perhaps, you know, there are perils to poetry, even though you didn't think there were, that hopefully the pleasures outweigh those perils. Thank you for listening, and get those pens out and write some good poetry. Thank you.
Now I can go. Okay, so big welcome to all of you. I was going to start with, well, I'll do it anyways. Assalamu alaikum, marhaban bikum, sayyidati, sayyidati. Bienvenue, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenidos, señores, señoras, and a big welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here today. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to be able to give this talk in all those 4 languages, so I'll keep it to English. Okay, so yeah, welcome. As you can see, the title for today up there is the 14 Kilometer Diaspora, Gibraltar's Forgotten Saviours. So again, it's a triggering title, and that's the whole point of it. The 14 Kilometer Diaspora, what the 14 kilometers relates to, is basically the distance between Gibraltar and Morocco, okay, and the Straits. And today we'll be talking about Gibraltar's biggest ethnic minority group, which is the Moroccan community, but also with a bit of a personal touch. So as you can see, some couple of pictures on top of me. Some of you might not know what they are, and I shall explain them in a second. So before I begin with the statistics, there is a personal touch to this story. So I was born in Morocco back in May 1994, and at that time, Moroccan workers here were not entitled to bring their families over. So I had to live away from my father and away from both my grandparents, because both my maternal and paternal grandparents worked in Gibraltar and came here when after the frontier was closed, and did their bit, and one of them is still doing their bit till today. So basically, all we were entitled to as Moroccan citizens whose parents worked and lived in Gibraltar was 2 months of summer visa. Okay, 2 months of summer visa was all we were entitled to, and therefore we had to accept it and move on. And that's how it was. There was no way of dealing with it. So I came here in the summer of '97 as a 3-year-old kid, and there I was playing, going to Quarry to swim, and lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, the piece of skin in the corner of my eye, on my right eye, starts growing. Parents didn't know what it was. Cancer back then was still quite an unknown thing. It was mainly affecting people who were older in age, and not necessarily younger kids. Everyone thought, 3-year-old kid, impossible. So, as you can see the pictures up there, the cancer started spreading, started off little in my eye, over here, started covering the whole eye, and the picture on the end is post-radiotherapy, and you can see the depression on the eye post-treatment. Thankfully enough, as we say in Gibraltar, que no hay mal que por bien no venga, as a result of the cancer that I ended up getting in '97, I was here in Gibraltar with the help of many people, and I'll name a couple of them towards the end of this presentation. Thankfully, they managed to stand side by side with my father and my mother, was sent to the UK for treatment to Royal Marsden, and eventually, upon my return, although unfortunately at the time there were many people who were lobbying against me staying in Gibraltar, there were others who were stronger than they were, and thankfully they stood by my parents, and I was given my residency, and I'm standing here speaking to you in English today. So I'll leave you with a question before I continue with the broader subject of this topic. Sorry, broader subject of this, what we're speaking about today. Question is, would I be here talking to you in English, or would I be a member of this Gibraltarian community that we're all so proud of if I didn't have the cancer? Keep it in your heads. Would I be able to speak to you as I am today if I would have just left back to Morocco after those 2 months? Let's keep the question there, and we carry on. Okay, so I'm using 2 case studies today, sort of live case studies that we can relate to, but in no way am I saying that I'm speaking for every single person from the Moroccan community, because every single individual story is completely different. Each individual has lived it in their very own way. And for me to stand here and claim that, oh, I know this and I know that, no. I can claim to know my story, I can claim to know where it's led me today and where I am today, but I can't claim to know anybody else's. I just try and push the message across so that, unfortunately, again, with subjects such as these, they are quite taboo. We don't speak about them enough, and I think we should, and I think it should be a part of our history, which is so important to remember, because we always hear the forgive and forget. You can forgive. Forgiveness is something that we all should have, okay? But to forget means to repeat. So we can't forget. It's something that we need to remember continuously, and hence why I'm speaking about it today. So what we see up here is an extract from the People newspaper. I couldn't find the date, although I tried, but it says, expect nothing from the Gibraltar government, right over there. It says from Gibraltar government just there. Expect nothing from the Gibraltar government. That's directed towards the Moroccan workers that had gone out in protest over rights, over multiple things that we will touch on in a second. So the example here is of Amin bin Hammo, the owner of the Amin office that has changed hands recently, the restaurant, and his experience after 26 years on the rock and paying around £57,000 in tax, if he would have lost his job, he could be deported. Okay? Him and his wife lived in not the best of accommodations, okay, as we've seen with Jonathan Scott's documentary on GBC recently, which highlighted the reality of life for many people. It is tough. Regardless, again, not entitled to any form of subsidized or, let's go back. Not entitled to any form of sort of government subsidized housing. A couple of pictures there, and these are the people I'll be speaking about in a second. We can see José Neto being dragged by police there for standing the ground and standing with the Moroccan workers. Something that I can assure you, none of them have forgotten to this day. And there are other characters like him and other characters who stood by me in my hour of need and in my family's hour of need, like Bernard Linares, God rest his soul. Till this day, my father remembers him and tears come to his eyes because it was someone who didn't see me, and again, I'll do something in a second that might seem a bit weird, but when you look at someone, he doesn't see me for something different. You're a human being, you've got a heart that beats. I can help you. It's humanity at the end of the day. It's not whether you're Moroccan, whether you're Chinese, whether you're Gibraltarian, whether you're Spanish. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with humanity at the end of the day. And if all of us were to focus on that, the world would be a much better place. Emin Ben Hammou's story, basically, he wasn't allowed to bring his wife. The rule back then was if you were working in Gibraltar, your wife could only come if she had a job. And to bring their wives, they'd have to find cleaning jobs with sort of armed forces, wives in the houses of people that were here with the armed forces, etc. That was like the loophole that Moroccan workers could access. The story here, which really touches me about Emin Ben Hammou's wife, it's the story of many Moroccan mothers at the time, is that she was pregnant, she went to the doctors for a checkup, they told her a delivery date, the doctor immediately called the authorities and said this Moroccan lady is pregnant. So the authorities, police, followed her home and said, if you don't leave by the time you deliver, we will forcibly repatriate you. Okay? Why, you may ask? Well, of course, if the baby is born in Gibraltar, then he's technically a British citizen and entitled to his rights. And that is something that we did not allow back then. Again, I do say, forgive, but don't forget. These things are part of our history. We need to embrace them, we need to learn them, and to drive away any existing resentment the minute we accept them and say, wow, what a time to be alive, what a time how people stood up for their rights and how we've changed and what we've become today. That is something we need to applaud ourselves for as a community. Regardless, so that was just one example of many, and that's Emin Ben Hammou's wife. The son, Ilyas, is a friend, and he's actually a Borders and Coast Guard employee today. So, and if I'm not wrong, that was the oldest son, and that was him. More pictures showing Moroccan ladies, just over here, sitting. I'm sorry, but the projection, you might not see it as well. Moroccan ladies sat over there. This is in the airport. They sat in the airport in protest, and at the time, the airport was the only method of sort of bringing things in to Gibraltar, and to cut it off, to have people sat there was a big problem, so they had to try and deal with it quickly. More pictures of men and women being forcibly removed by police, and they were protesting in peace. Before I move on to the next slide, God. Can you still hear me? Yeah? I was never good at artistic impressions, but that's my best take. Yeah. I might look different, but have I really changed? God knows. Let's keep that as another question in your heads. So yeah, more pictures. Mum, Dad, is the suit okay? Yeah? God. Don't want them telling me off later. So yeah. Again, more pictures of that demonstration. And that wasn't the only demonstration they did. There was others outside the convent. There was people talking for their rights. Mohammed Sarsari from the Moroccan Workers Association. He's up on... Okay, so this is more police dogs. Mohammed Sarsari is over there. Again, being forcibly removed himself. We can see a bit of a chokehold on another Moroccan worker there. Was that required? God knows. We're not here to judge. We're here to show certain things. And again, I didn't say this at the start, which I should have. But apart from not being able to tell everybody's story... 15 minutes is nowhere near enough to highlight the plight of the Moroccan workers here in Gibraltar. It is nowhere near enough. And again, what I'm trying to do in these 15 minutes is stimulate discussion, stimulate talks, see where we're actually lacking as a community, see where we're lacking in our history, in our public services, in what these Moroccan workers did for our community. So if I look at dates, and I remind myself here, the border was closed for over 13 years, okay, initially opened just for pedestrians, and then opened for motor vehicles later on, but it spanned from 1969 all the way to 83 and then 85, if I'm not wrong. Oh, it's over here. Yeah, 82, 15th December 82, it was opened to pedestrians, and then in 85, it was opened to motor vehicles. So in all this time, Gibraltar lost the Spanish workforce, and therefore, they had to bring someone. Brought the Moroccan workforce, over 2,000 labourers, without whom, okay, Gibraltar might not be the Gibraltar we know today. And why do I say this? I like backing my things with evidence. My uni professors would be proud because I reference and I cite. Okay, so, apart from a couple of laws I wrote down here to remember, Sir Robin Maxwell Hyslop, a former Tory MP, this is taken directly from Parliament archives, said on the 27th of July 1983, so this is when the border was already open to pedestrians, he said, "It would be a dishonourable day for Britain if we overlooked the interests of those people without whom, I repeat, the economy of Gibraltar would undoubtedly have collapsed following the closure of the frontier. Does my honourable friend accept that it was the wish of the Spanish government that it should collapse, but that many Moroccan workers filled the gaps and enabled Gibraltar to survive?" Okay, this is directly from an MP, a Tory MP for Tiverton, which is next to Exeter. So this was a conversation that some people higher up were having, but unfortunately it didn't trickle down at the right times. Pardon me. So, again, pardon the pun, but Moroccan workers in Gibraltar were stuck between a rock and a hard place. Okay? Literally. It was difficult for them. It was difficult for many of their families. And although I was given the right for residency, I still recall difficulties in my childhood with something so basic that if I spoke to you about it now, you'd be like, wow, okay? I didn't have a passport, and I wasn't entitled to a British passport until the age of 18. Why? Because neither of my parents had a British passport. Therefore, it meant I was locked into Gibraltar, and if I needed to go into Spain, we had to go to the UK to get a Spanish visa to be able to do that. I recall days when I was going for doctor's appointments for my treatment, and we'd try our best, my father and I, to find un huequecito to get an appointment in the Spanish embassy to get that visa and be able to cross the border. If not, we'd be locked off. So trips to Bahia Park, for example, down the road in Algeciras. For a while, I couldn't go. And then after a bit, when we started having good chats with the Spanish authorities, I'd have to go a week before with some of my teachers, so big thank you to all my teachers that helped with that, you know who you are. And I'd have to sign certain papers to be allowed out. So all of these things, and again, so much more I could be speaking. I'm looking at the timer and God, it's scaring me. I'd like to say something else. And again, these quotes, they hit home because they're very important. In Panorama on the 10th of December 2010, a report written by Unite, okay, supported by the Trade Union Research Unit in Oxford, was published on the eve of the International Day of Human Rights. The report proved that the Moroccan community are very hard workers, pay their taxes, take very little back. In other words, net contributors to the economy. It is now time to end over 40 years of discrimination and to give these hardworking and loyal workers the same rights as the rest of the population. They also went on to describe the treatment as economic racism, research reveals. And following this, another 54-page report by a barrister called Daniel Blackburn, Professor Keith Ewig, Professor of Public Law, and Jonathan Jeffries, a lecturer in trade union education, under the umbrella of the ICTUR, with the help of Jose Neto, the help of people like Bernard Linares. And they wrote this 54-page article. It was presented by Charles Cisarello, District Officer for Unite, and it further complemented the stance of the initial findings, and leading lawyers like Karen Monaghan in the UK. I'll wrap it up. Apologies. Yes, there is a lot more left for this, but thank you so much for listening. Maybe at some other point. Thank you for having me, Julian. Thanks for the rest of the team, and thank you for listening.